Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss, host of the program here. It comes on at 2 o'clock every Monday from 2 to 3. The program is called What's Going On AllPointsTV.com. We are normally followed on the second and fourth Mondays of the month by Sartorius Black History Corner, and we hope you will stay tuned for those programs when they come on. We want to wish Miss Catherine Hunter Williams the best, who lost one of her loved ones, lost a daughter, and she'll be back in the studio in June. Catherine, we're thinking about you here at the studio and want you to be well, and we send our condolences again to the family, and we know that you're going to heal and everything is going to be all right at the end. We're going to talk today in bulk about the Memorial Day celebration, but I want to do a couple of things before I get to that. I do want to make some different points about Memorial Day, something that has not been said by other persons that are coming upon this very important day, in which we separate Memorial Day from Veterans Day. Veterans Day, of course, we celebrate all the veterans of the armed forces. Memorial Day, though, is a little bit different. We celebrate on this particular day, the 25th this year. We're celebrating those who have died on the battlefields and are no longer with us because they gave the ultimate sacrifice in defense of the liberties of this country. We definitely want to acknowledge that because we owe them so much for the freedoms we have remaining here in this country, and we will be a lot less free if they had not made those sacrifices. We should never forget that. And we want to certainly give them a salute, and to the families of those members who have given the ultimate on the battlefields around the world and the battlefields of this nation. I'll be making some points today before we get off the air about Memorial Day that we have not yet come up with in terms of not only the beginning point, but also I'll be saying a few things that are different about the war in which the first memorial was held, and that would be the Civil War, the so-called Civil War, which has been mislabeled. And I'm going to try to make that case before we get off the air today. Before we get to that, I want to talk just a little bit about some other things here, basically about what is on Facebook. A couple of posts last week in terms of I had to engage a few of the persons out there who get on these posts and think that they know what they're talking about, and they try to challenge you on things that they have really studied only on the surface, or they have these sound bites that once you get past a couple of sentences in terms of what they know, you really have exhausted pretty much the extent of what they really know on these different topics. One of which was Malcolm X. One of the persons was stating. I was really offended by it, quite frankly. I'm one of the persons that has done a lot of study on the legacy of Malcolm X and have opened up some new doors to an understanding of Malcolm X's legacy. And I wrote about it last week because on February the 19th, on May the 19th, 1925, Malcolm X was born. And I wanted to make sure that the 90th birthday of Malcolm X did not go without being acknowledged. So in posting about that and making sure that that date was acknowledged on at least my Facebook post, I didn't see it in a lot of other places. I thought there'd be a lot of comments around the nation about this event. And I thought we would have something on the radio about it, but didn't hear a whole lot about it, but I didn't want it to pass in my particular case. And I did post on that. Well, a person gets on the wall and wanted to know how am I, who is in Africana Studies, mentioning the name of Malcolm X, and Malcolm X had changed his name. This is what this person was saying. Malcolm X changed his name once he went abroad and came back supposedly enlightened. And being enlightened, he changed his name to Malik Shabazz, El Hajj Malik Shabazz. And so that's his claim, that the name was changed at that time. And I'm surprised that you, a person that works at this level, and you didn't know blah, blah, blah. Well, I want to help you out because none of that stuff that you said is true. Now, let me help you with your understanding. First of all, this person said that all the descendants of Malcolm X would, in tandem, cry out against what you stated. And I asked him, does he have a sixth sense? Does he talk to dead people? And so he goes to the dictionary and pulls out the word descendant, puts it on the post, and want me to know that descendant mean those who are the persons that are the offspring, and those from whose roots persons are spring, and wanted me to know the term has to do with the application of the future, not in terms of the past. As I said, you must speak to dead people. Well, what this clown didn't know was that when you say that all of Malcolm X's descendants would in fact decry what I had said about Malcolm X, all his descendants would have to include his grandson, and his grandson is deceased. That's what I was referring to. And he didn't even know that. And then this other thing that was talked about, and I want to make this point clear because I want you to know something about what happens in terms of names inside the country and names outside the country. Now, his claim was that Malcolm X, in terms of going abroad and getting enlightened, changed his viewpoint, changed his name therein from Malcolm X to Malik Shabazz. None of that is true. You cannot go out this country and on a passport put X down by your name and be traveling internationally. And if you had known anything, you would know that when Malcolm X came back from the trip you're talking about, and by the way, Malcolm X was out of the country 5.5 months because he was running from those who were trying to get a chance to kill him. And Malcolm was really running for his life at this point. And on that trip where he made a certain dent in the international conversation around the world, England, somewhat France, wasn't allowed in France because de Gaulle did not want him in there, stirring up the Africans who were in France at this point. They had moved out of places like Algeria and certain parts with the French colonists, and they were in France right now. And if Malcolm came in there, they thought Malcolm would stir up the pot and create social disorder, so they didn't want Malcolm in there. And then all of these persons running off saying that they were afraid de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, who was president at that time, was fearful that Malcolm would be assassinated on the soil of France, so that's why they didn't let him into the country. That's nonsense also. The fear was that he would go in there and stir those persons from the colonies up in France, and they didn't want him in there for that particular reason, because Malcolm was a firebrand. The point that he changed his name on this 5.5 month hiatus out of the country is also incorrect. That's not what happened at all. Malcolm, when he came back from the being abroad for 5.5 months, they asked him, since he was signing his name now El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, they asked Malcolm in one of the interviews once he got back from that trip if he intended to use the name he was now using and had used in some of the postcards he sent back and some of the letters he had sent back to some of his followers here. And Malcolm said he would still continue to use the name Malcolm X until the condition that produced the name has changed. And then, of course, Malcolm had this way when he made a profound point and people had not caught up to the point he was making. What would happen is Malcolm would give that big, wide smile to draw you to what he had just said. And he gave a big smile after having said that I would probably use the name Malcolm X as long as the condition that produced it continues. But Malcolm also said in that interview that he's always had the name Malik Shabazz. The Malcolm X was a name that they used inside the country because the idea in the Muslim organization called the Nation of Islam, called the Black Muslims because of the book put out by C. Eric Lincoln. What I'm trying to let you see here is that you don't have anything to teach me. You may think that you do. In fact, I don't debate you because I only debate those who are equal. The rest of the persons I teach.
If I recall correctly, our conversations and also some of your former students brought up the fact that you actually knew members of Malcolm X's family.
I've had a lunch with Malcolm's older brother, Wilfred, before he passed. He knew me very well. We had many discussions. I ran some things by him, and he gave me some information. I also know the number one scholar out there, Malcolm X. I talked to him before he went out there to do the advising on the movie on Malcolm made by Spike Lee. That person's name is Paul Lee, and he was given film credits on the film. I talked to him before he went out there and had lunch with him in Detroit. And I told him some things, and he said to me, and these are his words, said, nobody's ever said that before.
What I don't think most people know, and they didn't show this in the movie because I didn't see the movie because I found out that there was a lot of stuff in it wasn't accurate, and also but they glossed over the fact that Malcolm X had lived here in Flint for several years.
That's right.
Yeah, and matter of fact, where he went through, I think, is taken up by the expressway. It goes through there now, 69, I think it is, I-69.
Mm-hmm.
But that was you spent several years here. It wasn't just a 1 or 2 year spell; it was several years here.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the parts of Malcolm's life has been glossed over. And it's so many things that you could tie into Malcolm, who was constantly undergoing transformation, not to the extent that you talk about it in the book written by Manning Marable. And that book is a travesty in terms of what Manning Marable wrote in that book. He didn't understand Malcolm's legacy at all. In fact, I think some of it is that he did understand. He was simply not being truthful in what he wrote, because Manning Marable wrote an introduction to the book put out on Malcolm X called Ghosts from Within, or something to that extent, that was written by John Carew from Trinidad. And in that book, he sees what John Carew said when Malcolm was in London, England, how Malcolm was untouchable, and how women were in his space, and Malcolm, they knew what John Carew talks in one situation to show you what kind of puritanical outlook Malcolm had once he had been changed from the street to being a member of the Nation of Islam, and then beyond that becoming a Muslim in his own right through his own organization he had founded called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and the OAAU, which was set up in August 28th, 1964. You can check those dates out. He had declared his independence and set up the Muslim Mosque Incorporated on March the 12th, 1964, after having broke away from the Nation of Islam, having announced that March the 8th, and 4 days later set up the Muslim Mosque Incorporated as a religious wing of the two organizations that he set up. One was religious and one was political. The OAU was set up on the basis of having been influenced by Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, who had organized in 1966 the OAU, the Organization of African Unity. Malcolm set up the OAAU, the Organization of African American Unity, which was to be the American prototype of the African organization. Malcolm having been influenced by Africa. That's another thing Spike Lee left out. He left out the influence on Malcolm in Africa. He went to show the influence in Mecca and in terms of the Middle East. But Malcolm was more influenced by what he had seen in the west part of Africa, particularly in Ghana, because of his admiration for Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of the independent Ghana. First of all, the Gold Coast, but the name was changed in 1957 when Ghana got its independence, having been promised that in 1954. I just simply run these things out and these dates and things like that so I can begin to make it clear that if anybody thinks that they're going to give me their notes and I'm going to take your notes on this, you're not going to do that. And you're out of your league. And I want you to be aware of that. You don't know anything. And you get on my post and embarrass yourself. So Malcolm X did not change his name when he came back from Mecca, and when he came back from his hiatus, 5.5 months in duration, coming back in February of 1960. He came back in February of 1965. And when he came back into the country, really, they were at him once he got back in. All the venom that had been alleged against him and thrown at him, they started stirring it back up because they wanted this man out of here. And the Friction Nation of Islam was not going to allow this, what they consider to be blasphemy on the part of Malcolm X, to rest. This man was going to meet his doom, and they were determined to bring that result about. I know all the names of the persons that was in the Alderman Ballroom. I know the temples they came out of. And so this was not going to be allowed to pass. And Malcolm was aware of that. That's why he was abroad for 5.5 months, because he knew the die had been cast. You can go read many books about it while he was abroad. There was a situation reported in the book by Leslie Alexander Lacey where a car backfired and Malcolm ducked down. Over there was Maya Angelou, whose name was, because she had married a person from South Africa named Maki, her name was Maya Angelou, M-A-K-E, Maki, because she had married a person from South Africa before she married another person later on that she chronicles in a book called The Heart of a Woman. But when they saw Malcolm over there ducking like that, they knew then that he was in imminent danger. And many of them begged him to stay out of America because they saw the duress that Malcolm was under. And Malcolm told them that he could not, he really was caught in the catch-22 situation, because Malcolm told them that he could not abandon those persons that were waiting for him to come back. And if he had taken the advice, he could have gone to a number of places. They were offering him places to stay as a refugee, but Malcolm would never have done that, but just to offer him some place to stay if he would just simply take them up on it. Haile Selassie had, for example, invited him to come into Ethiopia. He had a place there. He could have gone to any of the Muslim countries and stayed. Kwame Nkrumah had already invited, as of 1962, 63, had invited W.E.B. Du Bois, who's buried in Ghana. I've been to W.E.B. Du Bois's grave in Ghana. He's buried in Accra. They have a very sacred place set aside for W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the, well, I wouldn't say the founder, but the person that was he didn't found the NAACP. He was the person that founded the Crisis magazine, which was the literary organ of the NAACP. He's buried in Accra. I've been to that gravesite. And Nkrumah would have given him a place of reverence in Ghana because he was an admirer of Malcolm. Malcolm was an admirer of Nkrumah. But Malcolm couldn't do that, because if he had done that, he could not have been Malcolm X. And one thing about Malcolm, the gift that everybody's been missing about Malcolm X, is that this idea that he was profound in his understanding of history, that's not Malcolm's gift. Malcolm was not that profound in terms of history. You can see that in his favorite speech, which was to talk about the house Negro and the field Negro, where Malcolm made the comment that the house Negro was different from the field Negro. And that when the house Negro would say to the master, "What's the matter, boss? We sick," Malcolm thought that the house Negro was identifying with the slave owner. That's how Malcolm saw that. And they gave that as one of the typical speeches they would give. Gave it down there in Selma, for example. And you see that in the film called Selma, when they had Malcolm arriving in Selma when Dr. King was in jail. And they have in the film where Malcolm had arrived and Dr. King's in jail. And when Coretta went to visit Dr. King, he is upset because she has had Malcolm speak on the program at one of the churches there in Selma to the students who were in the SCLC, or an arm of the SCLC to an extent, which was SNCC, SNCC, and they have King correctly upset in the film with having Malcolm invited into that dare. So those of you who are trying to say that at some point Malcolm and Martin Luther King would have gotten together, and they would have in fact locked arms if they had enough time to iron out their differences, you can have that to challenge that notion. That would have happened. That was not going to happen. And nor should it have to happen. You don't have to have all the leaders under one umbrella. You have them in different organizations. And the question is, who are the leaders? Who's leading the leaders? And if they don't need to be led, then the person that leading don't need to be led either.
I think that's the expectation of white liberals, that all black leaders, for example, have to be of the same mindset. They're like carbon. I mean, they're the ones in that. I think that view is actually very racist in itself, because
It is racist.
they can't think that there's a possibility for variation of thinking, or actually seeing things that the other might not see or admit to. It's, basically, I never understood that. They basically, that's why you're not so widely accepted. People have a hard time conceptualizing that you're not in lockstep with all the so-called quote-unquote black leadership.
I'm out of step with them.
Right.
And I don't want to be accepted, because if I'm accepted, that means that I am part of the problem, which I think all of them are part of the problem. You can't have 90% of the people feeling a certain way, and then the community be in the shape it's in, and then what they have and the water they're carrying and the views they have can be correct. If, in fact, 90% feel the way they feel, and you have the problems all over the country that you see, they can't be correct. So I'm in the minority group. I don't carry that water. And my viewpoint is different from their viewpoint. They may not have all of the love and admiration, not that I seek any of it from them, but I tell you what they cannot do. They can't come against my scholarship. And I told them in my post, go get your leaders. I told them in my last post, take me to your leaders, because you're not cutting it. And the leaders are not going to cut it either. Particularly this one guy that they were quoting out here talking about reparations for slavery. And they were trying to quote him. And I was simply, inviting him to come into the space and have the dialogue. I'm not going to invite him in there, but if he wants to come into space and have the dialogue and want to initiate the conversation, since those carrying his water can't defend the position, then maybe they can get him to do that. But it won't be a nice day, and I'll challenge him also, because they don't have these my scholarship. They may think that they do. These are affirmative action doctors. I'm not affirmative action. And nobody's ever given me something because they opened a door up that I didn't have the merit to get through myself based upon my own merit. And there are not very many of them out there that got these PhDs today that can say that. Very few of them. I don't know. There's one in California. I know that this is affirmative action PhD, because I read some of his writings. And none of the stuff he's written makes any sense. I won't call this other person's name out. They were trying to try to get me into a dialogue with a man that even though they were discussing him on my post. I didn't get into that because that would have been unfair going behind his back. But I'm just making this point that when you look at the totality of what they claim, they make these little sound bites. And once you get out of their worldview, which is very limited, and get into a more comprehensive understanding of what is there, then they're remiss in order to come back with anything that's really concrete. Malcolm was not a historian, and he did not really understand slavery. He talked about it a lot, but didn't understand it. He was talking about the house Negro identified with his master more than his master identified with himself. And he should have been more aware of the poem written by Paul Laurence Dunbar, who wrote the poem in 1896, which was in a book of his poetry, the poem called We Wear the Mask. Where Paul Laurence Dunbar said, we wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouthed with myriad subtleties. And then Paul Laurence Dunbar asks, but why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise while we wear the mask. And if Malcolm had read that and had known where Paul Laurence Dunbar had gotten the idea that there was a mask that was being worn, he would not have been making the comments he was making about the house Negro and making a distinction between his feelings and those of the field Negro. In fact, these persons were pretty much in dialogue to the extent they could have dialogue with each other. And there was some reporting out of the house of what was going on. And some of the slaves in the house wanted to know what was going on outside the house. And there was a commonality there that if you read the slave narratives, you'll see it. There was not this distance between the two of them where there was this quote-unquote sellout. And no one had the word Uncle Tom as is being played right now during the time of slavery. And you can see that in terms of the narratives in the life of Nat Turner. Reading the narrative of Slave Turner as told by the attorney in 1831 by Thomas Gray, his court-appointed attorney. So this idea that he was some scholar, that's not true, and that's not really his gift. His gift is that he was honest. And that's what is said by the person that wrote the book called Remembering Malcolm, the person that introduced Malcolm the day that he was assassinated, the person that said prophetically, I'll give you a man now who is willing to give his life for you, a man who's willing to die for you. And then he was getting ready to sit back down. You know, Malcolm had come out on the stage at this time, sitting behind him, and Malcolm said, make it plain. And that was the words they would use when it was time, when Malcolm was ready to go up, he would tell the speaker, make it plain. That meant sit down and bring me forward. And that's when he said, prophetically, I'll give you a man who's willing to give his life for you. And he brought Malcolm up to the podium and got ready to sit down, and Malcolm sent him backstage because Malcolm knew. Malcolm knew. He knew they were out there. They had called his room that morning. They stayed at the hotel, and they called his hotel room. They had been in that hotel that night before trying to find out what room he was in. They knew he was in that room. Why? Because they had people planted in his organization. Malcolm said that they didn't know every move I'm making. They did know, because some of the person that came out of the Nation of Islam did not leave because of Malcolm. They left in order to report what Malcolm was doing back to the Nation of Islam. That's what was going on there. And they did know every move Malcolm was making. They knew he was in the hotel. Malcolm was staying away from his wife and family. Particularly after they bombed his house on the night of February the 14th, really the morning of February the 15th, because it was early that morning, and they bombed Malcolm's house, February the 15th, 1965.
Now, that was also the Nation of Islam. That wasn't the white supremacists or the KKK.
The Nation of look, I will not bite my tongue, and I will not dismiss the information that is on the table here. The Nation of Islam did it. They were after Malcolm X, and they were going to put Malcolm X in the ground if it was the last thing they did. They were going to kill this man because of a number of things, but there were some mistakes. There were some missteps that Malcolm X made also. And the scholars of Malcolm, those that are really the scholars of Malcolm, this guy that I'm talking about right now, not one of the scholars, he didn't know anything. But there are some scholars out there. And with the scholars, what you miss is, I think you need to go back. I said this down in Detroit at the Murray Wright Museum when they had one of the scholars, one of the person that pretty much knows about the assassination of Malcolm X. I don't think he knows a whole lot more. He wrote a book called Unraveling. It's called wait just a minute. It's Conspiracies. Yeah, it's Conspiracies with an S. He doesn't name it Conspiracy with an S. What he does, he puts the word conspiracy, he spells it CONSPIRACY. He puts an S there and underscores the word S. He's talking about conspiracies with an S. It's a conspiracy that's central to what caused Malcolm's life. But he's talking about there were other countervailing things that were going on outside the centrality of the conspiracy that cost him his life. The other things going on the outside also. Now, what critics have done is that they've grabbed those external things that did not have anything really to do with Malcolm's death, but things that were people were not. There were other persons that were aware of the danger was in. They didn't care about the outcome, but they were not participants in the outcome. Didn't have to. And I can even name a lot of things here with people saying, well, a lot of people, Dick Gregory and others, those persons are wrong too, in the conclusion that they've drawn about what actually happened. And Dick Gregory's comment, by the way, is way off the mark, talking about there were shooters at the top and Malcolm was shot from the top, and the person that came down that aisle had blanks in their guns. All of that is nonsense. And other things that Dick Gregory said also in terms of disavowing what Alex Haley wrote in the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is a book written by Alex Haley, and not an autobiography because Malcolm didn't write it, Alex Haley wrote it. And some of the comments in it have some questions about it. But Dick Gregory now says that he did not make the comment that's attributed to him in the book written by Alex Haley. Alex Haley said that Dick Gregory told Malcolm, having told Alex Haley, Haley wrote it, that Dick Gregory said something about Elijah Muhammad that was out of, I mean, you just don't say this in the name, we're using Elijah Muhammad's name the way that Dick Gregory used it. Now, Dick Gregory said the conversation never took place. He never denied it while Alex Haley was alive. He never denied it while Malcolm X was alive, and I do not believe him now in terms of his disavowal. And I can tell you what he said, by the way. It took me a long time to figure it out, but I do know what he said. And when he said it, Malcolm got very upset, according to the autobiography, and his instincts, because this is the way the Nation of Islam operated, his instincts was to attack Dick Gregory. Because Dick Gregory said that Malcolm, man, Elijah Muhammad ain't nothing but a, and then we mentioned that word, Malcolm's instincts rose up. Malcolm was very upset. He says that Gregory was street smart. He saw how upset Malcolm was, and he wisely led Malcolm away from that conversation and let him get off that subject. But I know what he said about Elijah Muhammad, and that was not the time and place and circumstance in the season to make that comment. And Malcolm said in the autobiography that he could not tell Gregory not to say to anyone else what he said to him, because that would be admitting the truth of what he had said. Malcolm was bothered by that. And to those scholars out there, I would tell you that you ought to go and look at the date. I'm not going to tell you what the importance of it, but I'm going to give you something to go chew on and put this into your analysis about what was really going on here, because Malcolm made some missteps also, some critical mistakes and missteps. And one of them was what he did on December the 10th, 1962. That's what I was saying down at the Murray Wright Museum to the person who wrote this book called Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X, Conspiracies with an S. And that is that what they miss is the part that Malcolm X played, because they want to look at it through a primrose glass, taking sides one or the other, rather than letting the evidence lead them to the conclusion. Malcolm made some missteps here. And one of those missteps was December the 10th, 1962. I'll let you find out what happened on that date. But I told them told these scholars at the Murray Wright Museum that Malcolm X thought he was dealing with he got outflanked. He underestimated Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad saw that there was a little less belief on Malcolm's part, because Malcolm had become unglued by what he found out about Elijah Muhammad, some of the frailties of the man, some of his human weaknesses that have not been explained away by Farrakhan, who has tried to act like these were his wives, but if they were his wives, it would not have been kept outside the Nation of Islam, kicked out once they were pregnant and you couldn't find a husband around them, and they put them in quarantine. The person sitting over the trial in some cases in Chicago was Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm couldn't tolerate that. Malcolm was bothered by that. And he began to fight. I don't mean out in the open, but Malcolm was secretly fighting behind closed doors, telling people, trying to act like he was trying to inoculate the ministers in the Nation of Islam against, if it comes out in the paper, they will be prepared to deal with the scandal once it broke in the media. Malcolm knew better than that. If you put anything in the paper about Elijah Muhammad, they'll just make the Muslims stronger. What Malcolm was doing, and he knew the way the Nation of Islam operated, because I knew it, and that is you don't plant seeds. You just don't talk about that. And Malcolm was talking about it. He was whispering in the Nation of Islam. And those whisperings came back to Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad saw what was going on, and he outflanked Malcolm. I'll tell you when he did it. He did it in Philadelphia. That's what I was telling him down there in the Murray Wright Museum. In Philadelphia, it was either September the 3rd or September the 6th. It's one of those two dates. In front of 5,000 Muslims in Philadelphia, he said, when Malcolm introduced Elijah Muhammad, he hugged Malcolm. He hugged Malcolm X, and he said, "This is my most beloved minister, and he'll follow me till he dies." If you know about the Judas kiss, That's it. Because there was tension behind the scenes between the two men, and there was no way that could be possible that late in their relationship, given the fact that if you say September the 3rd or 6th that this occurred, you got October, you got November, and you got December when Malcolm was put out of the Nation of Islam permanently. Under the umbrella, he's being silenced for 90 days. Malcolm was never going to be let back in that organization. And Malcolm knew it. But September the 3rd or 6th, Elijah Muhammad stands up and says, embracing Malcolm, this is my most beloved minister, he'll follow me till he dies. And the people saw him giving Malcolm credit. So when the split, which was inevitable, occurred, then look at how that looks. It's Malcolm. The messenger, quote unquote, has embraced this man. And now he's out here planting these seeds. Yes, that's what happened. And that tumbling effect is going to get worse. And when they asked Malcolm, why are they after you? Which they asked Malcolm after he had gone to court to get the house he lived in, because that house was not in Malcolm X's name. One of the mistakes Malcolm made in not having any kind of material involvement, didn't take care of the materiality of his family, thought the Nation of Islam would do it. If anything happened to him, they'd take care of his family. And that was a lot of the naivety of Malcolm X. And he would go around the house later on and they would be mocking. He and his wife, Betty, would be mocking that they had been so naive about that. He'd be kind of making fun of how he used to say that they'll take care of you, Betty, don't worry about anything. And Malcolm, when he woke up, saw that how naive he had been during that time period. They were not going to take care of Betty Shabazz. They wanted that house he was living in, although Malcolm had been told beforehand, go ahead and put the house in your name. Malcolm didn't want that. He thought that it would be a corrupting influence. So the real Malcolm has gotten lost in terms of making all these other claims about Malcolm, being some great intellect, some great historian. None of that is true about Malcolm. Malcolm's basic contribution and legacy for those who admire him is that Malcolm was, according to what Benjamin Kareem said, who was called Benjamin Goodman, 37, I think it's 37X, Benjamin X Goodman. I know it's Benjamin X Goodman, but later on changed his name to Benjamin Kareem. You can read his book called Remembering Malcolm, which is a very important book. It's not a large book, but it's a very important book about the legacy of Malcolm X from his vantage point. And in fact, Benjamin Kareem said when Malcolm was killed, he said, the man that you knew as Malcolm X was a stranger to me, because they could not deal with Malcolm changing so much. Because once Malcolm got out of the Nation of Islam, he was really curious about all the things that he had closed his mind to when he was in the Nation of Islam for 12 years. And when Malcolm finally, quote unquote, woke up, he wanted to know everything. He's reading books now they had not read before. And this was an honest man. Malcolm's legacy is his honesty, and not his historical reference, and not even that he did not have some non-material desires for power. Malcolm wanted to move the nation into the forefront of the civil rights movement. And he did not like to stay on the sideline. And that was a conflict that Malcolm had inside the Nation of Islam. And that conflict is getting Malcolm to do something very dangerous in the Nation of Islam. And people around Elijah Muhammad saw it. And that was Malcolm was in fact changing the teachings of the Nation of Islam. Nobody was fooled by Malcolm getting at that microphone saying the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, and then what Malcolm was saying after that was what Malcolm was saying, but trying to import it into the mouth of Elijah Muhammad. They had heard Elijah Muhammad, and they knew what Malcolm was saying was not Elijah Muhammad's voice. Go and run with that one. That was going on. And they looked at that as Malcolm trying to take over the Nation of Islam. And that was a problem also for Malcolm. And then the whispering that began to go on about the secretaries. Malcolm knew he wasn't supposed to talk about that, but was talking about it. So let's talk about these missteps that Malcolm X made, because he made some very serious missteps. And that was a very serious misstep, because you do not go into the Nation of Islam and start talking about things like that, about the quote unquote, the messenger. And Malcolm was doing that. Malcolm knew better than that, but did it anyway. And if you read the autobiography of Malcolm X very carefully, and I read it a number of times, I read it very carefully, because there are a lot of things, there are a lot of nuances in the Nation of Islam that if you don't read very carefully, you will miss this. And that is, Malcolm always had a certain two-ness about him. You know, the two-ness that Du Bois wrote about, when Du Bois wrote about the two-ness, one, he was saying it in a different way. One is that of a Negro, and then that of American. Well, Malcolm had a two-ness also. One which was a conscious Malcolm, where he was consciously always in control of his emotions. And then another thing that was operating in Malcolm, which was a more unconscious aspect, where there were some things that were in fact impulse that were driving Malcolm to do some things here where he was not quite as much in control of that. But he was a very disciplined man now, don't get me wrong about that. He was very disciplined. But there were some other things that were inside of Malcolm's psyche that was a little less patient with the process that he'd been placed under the Nation of Islam. Malcolm wanted some action, and the Nation of Islam was not going to get involved in the action, particularly if they had gotten into a comfort zone where there was a certain materiality in the Nation of Islam, which Malcolm had rejected. But that wasn't everybody in the Nation of Islam. Many had gotten comfortable with the money that's coming in from the selling of the newspaper by people sending tithes from around the nation and sending it to Chicago. People had gotten a very comfortable lifestyle out of that. And Malcolm was uncomfortable with that. And he was not corrupted by the materiality. But Malcolm wanted this movement to become more relevant in what he saw was going on out there. And this movement was one where it took the most militant blacks, locked them up, and didn't do anything. Malcolm wanted to change that. And he went and did some things that were not in the purview of the leader. And people saw that. And they interpret that as Malcolm having some ambitions. And they were saying in the Nation of Islam as early as 1961 that they're going to get Malcolm out of that organization. And people were saying, well, he spends all his waking hours dealing with the Nation of Islam's business. He's representing the nation every time he gets out there. And they were saying, be that as it may. As soon as the situation presents itself, he's out the door. And there are a lot of things going on in there in terms of the jealousies that you come in contact with, and all the persons that are in these positions have run into that, because if you rise to a certain position in the black world, you're going to have some problem with black people. That's just the way it is, folks. And I'm not here to mince any words with you. I'm going to tell the truth, and I don't care how you feel about it, because you can't touch this. And so everything I'm saying about Malcolm is can be checked out through the record. You don't know the record. You think you know the record. You said that he changed his name when he went to Mecca, or when he went on his trips, and he came back having been enlightened, and he learned something he didn't know ahead of time before that, and he came back here and having been changed by what he learned, he changed his name. That's nonsense. What you don't know is that when you go out of here with these names that you have, like Malcolm X or African American, you go outside the country, you can't use those. You cannot use Malcolm X in your passport. And Malcolm didn't use that on his passport. Malcolm, in 1959, Malcolm had gone to the Middle East to prepare the way for Elijah Muhammad. He didn't go into Mecca because he didn't want to go there before his teacher. But he prepared the way for Malcolm X, had prepared the way for Elijah Muhammad to go in there. And he went there in 1959 and went on the Hajj himself. He didn't want to precede his teacher in doing that, because Malcolm was beholding at that point to Elijah Muhammad. But he saw when he was over there in 59 what he saw in 1964. He didn't learn anything different 5 years later. Malcolm saw that in 1959. He didn't learn anything new. And those of you saying that he changed his name, that's what this one guy was saying. Explain this to me then. When Malcolm X died, February 21st, 1965, his daughter, his oldest daughter, was Attallah Shabazz. She was named Attallah Shabazz at birth. So if Malcolm changed his name when he went to the Middle East and he learned in 64 all these things, etc., then how do you explain the name Shabazz as a family name of Malcolm? And when he named his daughter, who would have been born in 59, Malcolm had gotten married to Betty in 58, how do you then explain that Attallah Shabazz has a name Shabazz before Malcolm went there in 64? Her name's already Attallah Shabazz. Why is that true? Because Malcolm's name is Malik Shabazz even at that point. He was always on Malcolm's passport. He didn't travel outside the country using the name on his passport, Malcolm X. And when he came back, they asked him, do you intend to use the name that you're now signing, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz? Do you plan to use that name? And Malcolm said in the interview that I will probably continue to use the name Malcolm X, meaning he'll use it here, and use it abroad when he's, in fact, speaking before groups, because he said, that's the name that most of them knew him by. It's just like the NAACP. We don't use the word colored people anymore, but that's how the group is known. If they change the name of this civil rights organization, was founded in 1909, to something else other than the NAACP, who would recognize the name? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We don't use the word colored people anymore. We should, because there's some colored people out there. But if they did that, then the gloss that they have, because the name is known as the oldest civil rights organization, you change the name, it's no longer that old organization, it's a new organization, because you're now finding it under a new name. And that's the dilemma that Malcolm was talking about. He's known as Malcolm X. And he said that I will probably maintain the name Malcolm X for as long as the problem, the condition that produced the name exists. And then he gave that big wide grin they would give when he made a profound point, but nobody had caught it yet. And Malcolm would smile, and you'd be riveted to what did he just say, and you go back to it, and then you listen to it for the first time, because sometimes you don't hear it because you're kind of halfway listening and don't realize this was the point this man was making. And he would bring you to that point. Well, you go and look at the tape and you'll see it. And he said that he always had the name Malik Shabazz. So that's why you have his children. The 6-year-old girl is in the Audubon Ballroom. The 4-year-old girl, Kabila, that's the one whose son, who was named after Malcolm. His name was Malcolm, named after his grandfather, who died. This person died recently. This person didn't know that this person had died. That's why he was saying that the descendants of Malcolm would decry what I'm saying about Malcolm X in tandem. Didn't know that when I said that you must speak to the dead, he wanted to define the word descendant, thinking that I'm talking about those who were the ancestors, a different thing. Those in the past. Descendants are the progeny going forward. And when you say I'm the descendant of, then you're saying that the persons that you're descending from are these persons who are in the ancestral group. So he's going to put the definition down like I didn't know the definition. And I have to tell this stupid idiot that you don't realize what you're messing with, because you don't know anything. You think that you do. Malcolm didn't change his name. On Malcolm's passport in 1959, when he traveled outside the country, had Malik Shabazz on it. And the reason why he's now using the name El-Hajj Malik Shabazz is because Malcolm is doing something else that's disingenuous, which was to make it appear that he saw something for the first time in 1964, and that's what would explain why he was now changing. Malcolm had seen the same thing in 1959 and came back and kept his mouth closed because it didn't fit the model that Malcolm was speaking from at that point in time. But the model has been changed. He's no longer a member of the Nation of Islam. He's setting his own organization right now. He's trying to develop credentials on his own. So what Malcolm is doing now is trying to defend why he's changing. And that's why he's saying he saw these things over here and so on and so forth. That would be just the Malik Shabazz part. The El-Hajj part is that he, for the first time, went to Mecca. And any Muslim goes to Mecca doing the pilgrimage, takes on the name El-Hajj, El-Haji. El-Hajj just means the one that took the pilgrimage. And it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and all Muslims aspire to do it, and all Muslims are compelled to do it if they have the means in order to do it.
I'm going to ask you a question. You don't have to answer it, but I'm just curious. Okay, in that format of stuff going on in the 60s, and you're aware, you're an educated, black man, and you saw the injustices. Did you ever feel the urge to join the Nation of Islam or anything? No, because my father was a Baptist preacher, and by the time I got out of college, which was in 1966, so that dates me, Malcolm X had been assassinated, and I could not do it under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad because I blamed Elijah Muhammad for Malcolm's murder. And I could not
I like the disciplined Nation of Islam because they were a very disciplined group at that time, not so much today as it was then. But I could not stomach the fact that I was a Malcolm X follower. I liked the Puritan view of Malcolm. I liked Malcolm's honesty. I had read the autobiography in '65 when it first came out, and I was an admirer of Malcolm, and I could not forgive what I guess I felt the same way Eldridge Cleaver felt about it, and that's what Cleaver was talking about in his book called Soul and Ice, where he put the onus of Malcolm's death right there at the where it belonged, because Malcolm said on February the 15th in the Ottoman Ballroom, I think it was, either there or it was the Teresa Hotel, one of the two, when Malcolm spoke on the 15th of February, that all Elijah Muhammad had to do in order to stop this internecine warfare that was going on, all he had to do was just wave his hand, and everything would have stopped. And Malcolm said he won't do that because he said Elijah Muhammad didn't love black folks. And the proof of it, Malcolm said in the speech called they call it a World Revolution speech, which is one of Malcolm's last speeches. It wasn't the last one, but some of the last speeches he gave. This one he gave on the 15th. And he said that he won't do that because Elijah Muhammad doesn't love black people. These are Malcolm's words about it. Because he said the proof of it is that they got their own people fighting each other and got black people killing each other.
Like, actually, it's a telling statement that W.D. Muhammad, which is Elijah Muhammad's son, if I understand correctly, did not belong to the Nation of Islam. There's another organization that he had. I guess there's reconciliation going on. Last I read something on the internet, but he was I think it was the American Muslim Mission. Don't quote me on that, but that's the name I think I was associated with. Mm-hmm. And so his own son, Elijah Muhammad's own son, kind of distanced himself from his father's organization.
He was Warif Muhammad, whose original name was Wallace Muhammad, but later on Warif when he became more orthodox in the Islamic group once his father had died. They had fallen out. In fact, when Malcolm was put out the organization, because of the affiliation and closeness between Warif Muhammad, who was more spiritual than the others were, more honest than the others were, so he and Malcolm were pretty much in an alliance. When Malcolm was put out of the organization, Warif was put out of the organization, also. In fact, what happened was that when Malcolm was killed on the 21st of February, 1965, Warif went to the Savior's Day, which would have been on the 28th of February, 1965, and begged his father for forgiveness because his life was in danger also. Go read this book written by the book called Malcolm X, the Man Who Changed Black America. That's written by Bruce Perry. And when you read that book, go in there and look at those pictures in that book and see where Clara Muhammad, who was Elijah Muhammad's wife, was upset that she thought that Elijah Muhammad might in fact put a hit on his own son. I'm not saying that would have happened, but you have to understand how the Nation of Islam operated. This was a messenger of God, the way he was looked at in the Nation of Islam. And when Malcolm went against him and when Warif went against him, that was dangerous. And Warif Muhammad, once Malcolm had been assassinated, knew the danger. And he came in there and asked his father to forgive him. And his dad told him to stand up in front of the membership that Sunday, which had been the 28th. And how do I know it was the 28th? Because on the 27th, they funeralized Malcolm. And on the 28th, which was that Sunday, they had the Savior's Day, the culmination of they started Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And the Savior's Day would be on that Sunday. And they had Warif out there and asked his father for forgiveness. Told the membership that he was not qualified to judge his father, and asked for Allah to do, and got in front of the membership and all of that, and they calmed that down. And that's pretty much what he had to do, because he was not going to be allowed to stand there in opposition to his father. Now, when his father passed, and his dad died in 75, when Elijah Muhammad died in 75, then what Warif did was get into the Nation of Islam, coming in first to act as if he's going to carry out his father's teachings. But Warif Muhammad had been influenced by what was going on in the Middle East. He was pretty much an Orthodox Muslim based upon the Quran, and that Prophet Muhammad of Arabia, the one who was born in 570 AD, was the prophet of Islam, not his father. In fact, he never really accepted that his father was a prophet. And so when he got in there, when his father died, he changed the teachings to more Orthodox Islam, and called the people there after Bilal ibn Rabab, or some say Rahab, in volume 1 of World's Great Men of Color by J. Rogers. You're going to read about Bilal Ibn meaning son of, Bilal the son of Rabab, in J. Rogers' book. And he called people, when he got in there, Bilalians, because he wanted to claim that Bilal, who had created who had been the first person to do the call to prayer in the muezzin, the tower where you call the Muslims to prayer, no one did it better than Bilal. And so he called the people, because they were black and Bilal was black, they called them Bilalians. Tried to do that for a while. They didn't really play that well, but that was what he tried to do. Call these Muslims, these black Muslims, rather than call them black Muslims, which was what C. Eric Lincoln did. He wanted to call them Bilalians.
Yeah, they used to have a paper that I saw circulated in the the elementary school I went to. The kids had it. Some of the black kids brought it. Bilal Speaks, or Bilal Speaks, yeah. I remember those. They're pretty radical.
In the place of Muhammad Speaks.
Yeah.
He was less radical than, when it was Muhammad Speaks, it was at its most radical point. And Farrakhan stays under Warif Muhammad for what amounts to about 3 years, and he remained quiet, which is something he had learned from Malcolm's example. He didn't agree with Warif Muhammad and how he was changing the teaching, but he understood you have to keep your mouth closed because this man is in charge. And there's a lot of things to that too. I won't go into all of that, but if he had risen up at that time in 75, 76, 77, that could have been a problem for him. So Farrakhan, taking a page from Malcolm, kept his mouth closed. Malcolm would have been well served to have done the same thing. When he found out, he should have kept his mouth closed about that. That wasn't to be talked about. And this is some of the missteps that Malcolm X made. Now, I spent a little bit more time on that than I wanted to, because I wanted to make sure that I showed that you can't tell me anything about this period of history that I don't already know and haven't gone through. And this surface understanding that this person had, I did want to make it clear that I understand your limitations, and I wanted to make it clear that you cannot come into this arena here and have a discussion. There cannot be a debate, because you don't have enough information to debate me with. I wanted to make that clear. Before I get off the air, I want to say something about Memorial Day. I want to make this point, and I want these scholars to listen carefully, because I want to open up some new ground for them. The Civil War that you claim took place from 1861 to 1865, this 4-year war was not a civil war. The Civil War was a war that was fought in Congress. And what I mean by that is that there's the foundation of the war that was going on in the aftermath of the Constitutional Convention was the warfare, the Civil War going on between all these factions that have been brought together in a very brilliant way by the founders, who had all these varying political, economic, social, and economic interests. They had to bind them together through a number of compromises to create what was called the United States of America. But it was never united as the name would have implied. This was very disunited States of America. But the framers did their work in terms of finding a way to glue all these discordant interests together in something that would get ratified by 9 of the 13 colonies, 9 of the 13 states, in order to produce the United States. And they left it to the progenitors, those that were the politicians to follow them, to do the rest of the work, which was to heal the wounds that were still there, being incubated, through which the real Civil War was going on, which was a political war. And I wanted you to be aware of something here. It is a breakdown of the next generation to do that work that ends in terms of causing the secession which occurred because the political unity was not fulfilled by those who had 74 years from 1787 to 1861 to glue the nation together and do the rest of the work that had to be done. And because it was not done, it led to the shooting war. This is not a civil war at this point. The Civil War was the war that was being fought in Congress. And what's been hidden in history is that this was a failure on the part of the politicians. This is not a civil war. This is a war of secession. And they're leaving because the politicians have not resolved the problems that are congruent to the interests of all the parties who are now inside of this nation. And the South now decides that the political interest is being negotiated in the Congress, in this war going on in the Congress. I don't mean they're hitting each other. Some of them, Charles Sumner was hit. But the war is not a shooting war. It is a war of the ideas going back and forth, and there's this friction in the country. If they had ironed it out, secession would not have taken place. So then the secession, which is the war of secession, is the South deciding that it cannot have its interests, regional interests, satisfied inside the Union, and that's why they decided to vacate the premises. Out of that then comes Memorial Day, and I said in my post here that if we're going to celebrate Memorial Day, and go read my post, I did a much more comprehensive thing on Memorial Day. I said that on this day, Memorial Day each year, we should come together as a nation, come together in unity as a nation, and demand that all political leaders in this country on this day stand down. I don't mean they will stand down, but we should use this day to make that demand because history requires it of us. Okay, go read the post. You'll learn something there different because I'm carving out new ground that nobody else is carving out. Okay, we'll get together next week, be back here at the same time, same place at allpointstv.com. Until that time, I want you to follow your dream because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.